This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the British science fiction television series Doctor Who. I have Richard D. Carrier. He's a fan and an enthusiast who has done a marvelous series of a dozen or more short documentaries on the eras, and we will talk about the show and his life as well. Richard D. Carrier is my guest. He is the owner of Clever Dick Films. It's a YouTube channel, and I don't know if it's a company as well. I'll ask him. And he has a series of really good videos, as good as any that you'll see on DVDs about Doctor Who. And I think they're actually better because rather than just the standard spiel, you give a personal view, and whether one agrees with you or not, it's always interesting to hear someone who's passionate about something. So welcome, Richard. If you could take 2 or 3 minutes and give a little background about yourself, about Clever Dick Films, and your Doctor Who obsession, if it's an obsession.
Oh, yes, it is. I think so. Well, I've always been interested in film and television, and I've always been a bit of a sci-fi fanatic ever since I was very little. I grew up with Doctor Who really as sort of part of my part surrounding me, although by the time I was old enough to really be aware of things from day to day, it actually finished on BBC television. So I sort of came to Doctor Who and became a fan through the discovery of it in the 90s when it wasn't on television, and there were, from time to time there were efforts to bring it back. I studied media and film and theatre at college, so I was always sort of interested in media, in the creation of media and the analysis of it. And I went on to do a degree in film and media production, and from there I did work briefly in the industry for a digital television channel. But I found very quickly as I moved into there, I was very fortunate to sort of jump in above the usual making tea and being a runner for people role. I was assistant cameraman and co-producer and editor and things like that, and we made sort of daytime television programs. We didn't have much creative input into it. That was down to the CEO. But the real turning point for me was we were making a sort of, would you call it like a show that was about helping people. It was about supporting them and giving them a makeover and all this kind of thing. As I said, I didn't have any input into the creative side of it. And we had been filming an interview with someone, and it was the first contestant, if you will, was being interviewed, and she was talking about the trauma that she'd suffered. And later on, we were watching the footage back with the CEO, and he said, "Oh, it's good, it's really good, but you should have said something that made her cry, because that would have made for better television." And for me, in that moment, I thought, I really just don't want to be a part of this. And I think 80% of television these days tends to be some sort of point and laugh, humiliation, kind of sort of modern version of sort of like bear baiting or something. So I reassessed really the sort of career trajectory. Obviously, was still very much interested in creating things, but wanted to do something that was I had more control over. So I then trained to be a teacher. Originally thought that I would teach media because that was obviously my degree, but through various things I ended up becoming an English teacher, and then so since for about 10 years now I've been an English teacher. And I thought, well, I'll go and do that, and that will then allow me to, in my free time, to pursue creative projects that I could do myself with new media technologies like YouTube coming along and really picking up steam around that time. I thought, well, there's an opportunity. Little did I know how all-consuming being an English teacher would be. So I really didn't get any free time at all. And it came to a point soon after I got married and got a mortgage and all that kind of thing where I just had no free time. And I thought, I need to step back from this. So I resigned from the head of English position that I had held. And now I work as an English teacher / what we call progress tutor. So I work with groups of students to support their literacy. But the main benefit of that is I don't have to take lots of work home like I used to do. So really from the point where I started that role about just over 2 years ago now, it's allowed me the opportunity finally after all this time to really, pursue some of those projects. And so I thought I'd recently started watching Doctor Who in order because the DVDs were released in a higgledy-piggledy way. They weren't sort of like Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. And it got to the point where I pretty much got all of them that were extant. So although I'd seen all the stories, I hadn't seen them in order. So I started watching them right from the beginning. And I thought, well, what would be good here is if because I'd looked on YouTube just as an enthusiast and trying to see other videos that people had done. And at that time, it's changed a bit now, but at that time, there was very little in the way of, that wasn't just a sort of a talking head type YouTube video, the typical thing you'd have on YouTube, and which is fine. But I thought, well, maybe there's a niche here, perhaps to make some documentaries that other people will be interested in, and will also, afford me the opportunity to really flex my muscles when it comes to editing and video creation. So I wrote a little script and made a brief 15-minute video as an introduction to a series that I hoped I'd be able to go on and do. And it was very much sort of trial by error, because I didn't know whether it would be allowed to be shown, because it obviously included clips from the television program. I thought I might have copyright claims and all this, so it was sort of testing the water. But it went through. All my videos get automatically flagged by the copyright bots at YouTube. Yeah. But then when they review it, they say, no, that's okay. It's for the purposes of a review, although I can't monetize them. But that's fair enough, because the main goal was to make the programs. And so from there, I then set about just sort of, making episodes. I decided I'd do an episode on each era of the Doctor, talk about the production, really just make what I would want to see, and to kind of, over 20 odd years, kind of just like a sponge sucked up all this trivia about the program, the lore, but also the production side of it, and the social historical factors, which I thought were I still do think they're very important in appreciating the program from a modern standpoint. And so I just wanted to kind of just distill all that into little videos, and as always, it took about a year or so before really people started noticing, and then it just sort of picked up steam about a year and a half ago, and I've had some really nice feedback. I didn't want my channel to be called Doctor Who Documentaries, and rather called it Clever Dick Films, because as I say, Doctor Who is obviously a big passion of mine, but I would at some point like to branch out and do some other kinds of projects, maybe something completely original, like a documentary about a particular historical period, which I could film things for, rather than just editing material together. But due to the sort of work-life balance I have at the moment, any other project's obviously going to knock my Doctor Who videos back substantially. So I'm sort of mainly focusing on that for now.
Well, let me just ask you, so Clever Dick, are you hoping to one day be able to make it an actual business for some revenue?
Well, I recently, after some trepidation, did create a Patreon page for my channel, and I've been very flattered by the number of people that have signed up to be patrons. I mean, it would be nice. I don't have any definitive plans as such to create a company that people would work for me as part of it. I think really first and foremost, I've done it for the love of creating for the program and for creating the documentaries, and I've kind of sort of seen opportunities when they've come along for collaboration or interviews like this one, is very flattering and great, and I try and take those opportunities when I can, but I don't have a definite game plan as such for the future. I think it would be amazing if I could do it full time, and obviously I'd be able to get my things done a lot quicker if I could devote more time to it.
Yeah, you mentioned the work-life balance, art work-life balance, and a lot of people. I'm a writer. My wife's a writer, and a lot of people who aren't in the arts don't really understand the desire to do something. Most people come home from a day after work, sit down with a beer, watch some Netflix or something. But for me, every hour, like earlier today, I was just working on another play of mine, and so when you say that you want to do creative stuff, it sounds like, do you want to be, a documentary maker more, or do you want to do fiction films at some point?
Well, that's a good question. I think I've always wanted to tell stories. When I was younger, that was primarily fiction, and I read lots of fiction and still do. But I think in the last few years, I've found a lot of the time that the things that I find very compelling to learn about tend to be real things, historical events and incidents. And I'm not sure really. I think that I'm not sure I think I'm a better documentary maker than I would be a fiction filmmaker as such. So I think that I'm more inclined towards doing something like that. And I think also it's practical concerns as well, because I see the benefit of making the documentaries that I've made is that I can pretty much do it all myself.
Yeah.
And when it comes to making a film with characters, you know, you've got actors and you've got all those kinds of overheads and things like that come into it. And when I was at university, I made drama films, and yeah, I'm proud of what I accomplished, but I would never really think that, you know, taken out of a student context, I don't think they'd be appreciated particularly highly. I don't think they're very good in that regard. So I think I would be better as a documentary filmmaker. But it does come down to time and money, really.
I know I have a popular website, and I've gotten, you know, I don't know, 700 million viewers over the almost 20 years that I've had my website, Cosmoetica. But when I went to make these interviews, I think I have one interview that has maybe 15,000 views. People just don't want to sit for 2 hours and listen to two intelligent people just talk without a lot of graphics. And so how do you balance when you're doing, especially not necessarily the Q&A videos, but doing the actual videos that could be, you know, end up being like a 6 or 7 hour documentary? How do you balance, well, I really want to touch on this point, but do you say, but that's a little too esoteric, you have to have a little jazz, a little pop in there to get the casual people to? How do you balance what makes an interesting and also a video? Because I just taking a quick look, it looks like your Baker and Pertwee videos are your two most popular ones.
Yeah, so certainly the Tom Baker one is the most viewed, and I put that down to the subject matter.
Right, yeah.
I think some of my subsequent videos are better in their detail as well as their production value, but obviously Tom Baker's going to be the draw because he's the one across both England and America especially that people associate the most with Doctor Who, aside from perhaps David Tennant. So I expect when I get to the David Tennant one, I'll have a similar influx of views as such. But I think beyond that, though, you know, a lot of people who really enjoy the Tom Baker one are the ones that have gone on to then watch the others and bring it up. And a lot of people have commented that my videos are very effective in, as you say, giving that information with so much detail and yet still making them quite entertaining, perhaps. I think that it's a hard thing to explain why. It's not something that I set out to do. I don't think all people at this point are going to be bored, or at this point they're going to be entertained as such. Obviously, as a having written things before and made productions before, and obviously written essays and things like that, I think I have. It's not so much a conscious thinking at the time, awareness of the reader or the listener or the viewer, but I think inevitably, having done so many pieces of writing and being an English teacher, it sort of becomes somewhat ingrained that you're aware of your audience, perhaps. But I think when I do quite detailed parts and sort of dive into social historical context and things like that, I see it as somewhat of a fun challenge to, you know, how can I create a visual image or slideshow of something that would accompany what I'm talking about, that would, you know, elevate it and make it a bit more interesting. I think partly it's the pacing of the video, the use of music, the use of even just a slight movement on an image will not trick the viewer as such, but it will make them less aware that what they're essentially listening to in another context might be quite difficult to focus on. You know, as you say, over time, I mean, we apparently in a lecture, students only take about 5% of what is said and actually remember it, and they forget all the rest. So that format isn't always the best way to learn. But I think that the use of the music and the images to accompany the text is really what makes it more interesting. I mean, that was a thing when I was looking on YouTube before, seeing what other people had done. Frequently they were things where someone, and I know this is what YouTube is for, but still, you know, plonk a camera and point it at themselves or point it at their bookshelves and say, these are the stories. And the simple fact is, I think that that's always going to have a very, very niche audience of someone who probably already knows as much as they do about the subject matter. And I really wanted my series partly to act as a primer for people who didn't know the classic era, who had come to Doctor Who in the modern era and didn't really know anything about that, and found that big, enormous library of stories somewhat intimidating, not knowing to start, really. As I wanted it to be somewhat of a guide. I mean, I called it analysis and review, but that was really in the beginning, I suppose, to make it more obvious that it was the kind of thing that they would get. Whereas really, I mean, it should be called Doctor Who Guide, I suppose, because it is really like a guide through the eras of the show. I never really cut anything out. I tend to keep, the first thing I do is obviously I write the script and then I record that. And I clean up the audio, so I take out breaths and things like that, so it's not difficult in a way to listen to. And then I lay it down into the edit suite, and I've already, as I've written, had an idea about what I'm going to show, but some things sort of grow out of that. Usually the most difficult part is when I talk about the process of casting the Doctor, because usually there isn't really any kind of video material to use, so it's like finding images of the actor when they're younger and different productions they've been in. That usually is more of a show. Once I get into talking about the program, I can use clips a lot of the time underneath what I'm saying, so if someone's getting a bit bored with what I'm saying, they've then got the video clip to focus on as well. And I think it's knowing, as I watch through, somewhat of an intuition, if that's not too vain, of knowing when there needs to be a bit of a pause for that to sink in. And I think that comes somewhat of being a teacher, of knowing when to give people time to reflect on what has been said somewhat.
I'm glad you mentioned that you call them analysis and review, because too often on YouTube and even online Film Critics Society or whatnot, they don't really analyze. They're not really doing criticism as much as it's just, yo, dude, thumbs up, you know. Whereas you do analyze, and you can you go off on little digressions here or there, and there are moments. It's been a few weeks since I watched all of the videos it made, the dozen or so, but I remember there being things where I think, oh, he's going to do this, and you didn't go into the usual, there was tension on the set and this one. You went into talking about maybe a specific episode, like you said, the later ones especially, about the other guy, Colin Baker, the last of the classic Doctors, or the second to the last of the classic Doctors. You went in about you know, his turmoil and why he walked off the set and didn't want to do the transition scene or whatnot. And so that's one of the things that sticks to me as an artist. I said, oh, this guy isn't just a fanboy. And I mean that well. You really know your craft of putting the videos together. So I just wanted to state that.
Thank you very much.
The social historical context I wanted to talk a bit about as we end this first segment. Do you think that the show, if Doctor Who was pitched now without any background, could succeed, or do you think it's just become an institution?
I think it would depend somewhat on the nature of the pitch. I think the essential premise of the TARDIS and this sort of, I mean, we certainly in Britain take the image of the TARDIS now quite for granted as, you know, that's the TARDIS. But at the time, it was indistinguishable from anything else you'd see on the street, because there were police boxes around. And I suppose the equivalent now would be, you know, like well, that's even out of date now, but I was going to say telephone box, but we don't see those very much anyway. But the idea of it comes from, you know, Chronicles of Narnia and the idea of the wardrobe that leads to a magical world. I think that the character of the Doctor, as originally presented, of this kind of eccentric, somewhat, he wasn't entirely a clear-cut hero originally. He was more of a kind of a mischievous, essentially good, but could be, could be somewhat untrustworthy. And then you've got the hero characters. You've got your audience identification figures with the young companion as a thing for children to get into. I think that's somewhat timeless.
Yeah.
So I think that certainly would appeal. I think that obviously the way in which the stories would be told, some of the things that are being explored, I think are they're still relatable, they're still topical to some extent, but there are other things that have come up since. So a good example would be the Cybermen as villains were originally, very heavily influenced by sort of Reds Under the Bed, sort of Invasion of the Body Snatchers style thing, and also the general fears at the time of as I was talking about in the video, the idea of drugs, psychotropic drugs, and things like that, and also prosthetics and things like that. Obviously, in the modern day, that would be done somewhat differently. And in fact, when they brought them back, it became more of a fear of upgrading technology and social media and things. And they said things like delete, and so it very much fitted into a modern context. So I think certainly it would work, but obviously if you brought it back and filmed the very original episode in a modern context, even with modern technology, it would not necessarily be successful, I think, because television and story making in television has changed somewhat. But I think the core ideas are there, and I think that's why when they did bring it back in 2005, it worked so successfully. It wasn't purely, you don't, in England, 9 to 10 million viewers is a substantial viewership of an overnight program. And you don't get that amount of viewers purely based on nostalgia and sentiment from before. Especially what I'm going to explore on my next video at the beginning is the fact that at that time, Doctor Who was seen as a kind of best forgotten, silly, cheap program that you were kind of made to feel it was a guilty secret if you were a fan of. So to go from that to what it became in the space of just 1 or 2 years is quite an achievement, and I think a testament to, beyond all the superficiality, whether it's snazzy special effects or rather cheap special effects, the core of it is something that appeals to different generations.
Yeah, you had mentioned in several of the videos about the cultural impact and the early shows, especially with things like the Daleks, and there was the Peter Cushing in the movie. I'm just wondering though, with the original Doctor Who, and I'm opposite of most of the people in that I know the original 6 or 7 Doctors. I don't have cable TV, so I don't know the new show other than clips that I've seen about it. And I just, well, I guess I'll put this off to the next segment, but let me just ask one final thing here. The Doctor Who, I was watching before we did this interview, as I was writing, taking little breaks, watching old game shows here from the U.S. And I find it interesting that when you watch these shows from the 50s or 60s or 70s, it does give you a broader perspective. And Doctor Who, at least in the 26-year initial run, I always saw the callbacks to earlier things. And I think that's a part of the show. I don't know if that would necessarily be nostalgia, but does the new version of the show for the last 12, 14 years, whatever it's been, does that also interweave the old and the new? It's not a reboot.
Yeah, definitely. No. I mean, that was the thing. I mean, in the 90s, when they were sort of casting around thinking about bringing it back in one form or another, a lot of the ideas were to completely reboot the show. And I think the benefit of having fans who had it was very much the inmates had taken over the asylum by the time it came back. We have some very prestigious writers, and still do, who are big fans of Doctor Who and had grown up watching it, then got the keys really to bring it back, and they did it in a very, very effective way. And the fact that they knew that there's a fine line, I think, between being true to the past and acknowledging it, and then sort of like overwhelming new viewers with a kind of over-reliance on continuity and past storylines and minute details. So they very cleverly balanced, when they brought it back, they introduced the key ideas again to the audience without contradicting anything from before. They didn't, though, go into the minute details and talk about every single thing. But as the show continued in the modern era, there were returning enemies, there were references and little side jokes almost that you didn't necessarily need to know the part of the show to get. But if you did, it was like a little extra cherry on the cake. There are times, I think, where it has perhaps made the mistake of being a little bit too reliant on the original series and sort of done what people have labelled fan service. But I would argue, I don't think it's too much. It's really to the detriment of the program. I think if you don't know that in one of Peter Capaldi's episodes, the interior of the TARDIS looks exactly like William Hartnell's TARDIS, it doesn't actually affect the storyline. So you can still appreciate it in that way. So yeah, they've kept true to that. And I think that's something to be quite grateful for as fans, that we haven't got, But then saying that, some people are never happy and think that although they've got that, it's not true to what it was originally. And I would disagree, because I think if you look at, say, 1980s Doctor Who and compare that with 1960s Doctor Who, you're going to note a similar amount of differences. But if the core fundamental ideas and heart of the show is there, then I think it does stay true to it.
Well, Richard, let us talk about the genesis of the show and the early years, the first Doctor, William Hartnell. I did not know, although it makes sense when I heard it, I did not know that the show was originally started out to be partly educational, which accounted for the meetings of the great Khans and these time traveling things. And I'm going to ask you about a specific time travel episode that I remember very clearly from the early 80s when I first saw it here in the U.S., but I'll mention it when we get to it. But so you mentioned in one of your videos that one of the forerunners was the Quatermass character, who was Quatermass in the Pit is probably the most famous episode, and it became, I think, in the U.S. they did a film of it called 20 Million Years to Earth or something, a version of it.
There have been a few adaptations over the years.
So. Let me just ask then, if you could just briefly summarize who Quatermass was and the connection that you think that was Doctor Who, and have there been any other influences? Because I've got one that I don't know if you'll know of, but I want to just hear your comments first about Quatermass and any other earlier influences.
Well, Quatermass, certainly that had really captured the sort of the zeitgeist in when it was shown. There was a BBC adaptation on television. Is very, very similar to early Doctor Who in its production, and that had really, really been popular. And certainly that idea of the kind of the scientist as the hero, and the knowledgeable person, not the gruff military type, I think had an influence. I think that the most marked influence that Quatermass had wasn't so much on the Hartnell years, and more when it got to John Pertwee, and they were kind of, in a way, rebooting the show and changing somewhat the dynamics. And they took that idea of the scientific advisor and the laboratory base and the fighting off alien invasions as their kind of template. I think originally the Doctor Who itself was kind of inspired very much by a lot of classic works of literature, things like I mentioned, Narnia, with the wardrobe being this window into another world, and Doctor Who has always borrowed in an affectionate and homage way from famous films, famous works of literature. You have shades of Sherlock Holmes in the Doctor's character, certainly in his more gruffer incarnations, or his more dismissive and arrogant incarnations. But there's also shades of that kind of fairy tale stories, such as Winnie the Pooh with Tigger, and that kind of eccentric, literally bouncing off the walls, has influenced Doctor Who over the years. So I think it was definitely influenced by those things. I think that the original premise was it to be as you say, an educational program specifically for science and history. And I think that grew out of a general ideology at the BBC that were certainly stronger then, that because the BBC somewhat uniquely is a publicly funded organisation, but unlike say PBS or something like that, who I believe rely on donations from viewers, it is paid for by a license fee, which pretty much everyone in Britain has to pay for. And what that means is that beyond just providing entertainment, they have a responsibility to produce programming which is supposed to educate the nation. And I think this is really the root of programs like David Attenborough wildlife documentaries, which are so popular overseas, and the level of quality in them is partly grown from that philosophy. That this is a big company that's investing energy and time and talent into making educational programs, rather than some networks who perhaps will make those programs but do them much cheaper, far cheaper, and just have a voiceover with some stock footage. So, they take it a bit more seriously. So I think that was part of it. And so a lot of the early decisions, such as the characterization of having the teachers, one's a science teacher, one's a history teacher, and the child character is very similar to the child heroines of, like I say, Chronicles of Narnia or Alice in Wonderland or something like that. And the idea with her was to be the audience identification figure, the audience primarily being young people, between the ages of about 8 and 13 or something, and to visit scientific sci-fi worlds, and then to go to historical eras, and some of which were on the curriculum, so at our schools then, so young people would recognize things they'd been learning in school, and some perhaps weren't. And in fact, I'm fascinated by history, and a lot of the historical periods that I'm fascinated by were kind of spurred by that initial dip in Doctor Who. The issue was that very, very early on, the first alien planet they go to is Skaro, which had the Daleks in.
Yeah.
And the Daleks are the epitome of everything that Sidney Newman, who was the executive at the BBC who had kind of conceived of Doctor Who, said Doctor Who should not do. He didn't want bug-eyed monsters.
Yeah.
And of course, the Daleks are the epitome of a bug-eyed monster. So, but they were so popular and led to this, as it's called, Dalek mania, that after a while, they realized from the audience appreciation reports that young people and families were preferring the sci-fi monster stories. So by the time we get to Patrick Troughton in the late 60s, it kind of just turned into a big monster fest, and which is, it has its moments. But I do feel a little bit sad that some of those historical stories fell by the wayside. And I always kind of like Doctor Who now, when there's not been what's called a pure historical really since the 60s, on television anyway. That idea that there is no alien influence, there's no extra element, but in those days they were historical dramas that didn't have aliens in. And I still like the Doctor Who stories when they do go back to history, even if it turns out that there's a bunch of aliens that are trying to set the plague off in England. I like the opportunity that the programme takes to teach you a little bit about the period and the time and evoke that kind of setting.
Yeah, I want to just, as you were talking, it struck me with thinking of the historical stuff of a second influence I wanted to mention. Since you're in Britain, I'll start with them. Have you ever seen Alfred Hitchcock's film The Lady Vanishes?
I haven't actually. That's one of the few I haven't seen. I did a unit at university on Hitchcock, but I know of it. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, because in it there are two comic characters called Charters and Caldecott who became popular and were given their own film series in the 40s. And they go to exotic places around the world. And it just struck me that a lot of the early historicals, and I probably have only seen maybe 7 or 8 of the Hartnell era, maybe 3 or 4 of the Troughton, but they reminded me of the Charters and Caldecott comic films of the 40s. So I don't know if you ever get a chance that you can find them online. You may want
I'll have to look it up. I wasn't aware of that. No, definitely. I mean, I think, Doctor Who was made very differently to how it is now. And generally, programs now are made. You have the showrunner who is the primary writer. You might have 2 writers, and then they set the tone. They might have individual writers, but they have a tone meeting, and there's a whole production office, and there's a lot more thought into the pre-production in those days. And really, right up until the end of classic Doctor Who in the 80s, television programs like Doctor Who were made with essentially a producer and a script editor,
Yeah.
who would have, you know, a lot of control over the stories, but essentially they would hire writers and the script editors would go in and tweak things. And what that really resulted in was, some, at the worst, a lot of inconsistency in quality and tone, because they'd have different directors for every story, different set designers, production designers. But also what it meant was there was a lot of variety, and a lot of variety in the ideas, because I think the writers perhaps were a little bit more in control of the ideas they could bring to the table, rather than the showrunner sitting down saying, right, we're going to have this story, this story, this story, this one's going to be in World War II, this one's going to be in whatever, and then they commission the writers to write those stories, but they're kind of writing to order in a way, whereas I think at that time it was like, we need a sci-fi story, so let's ask Terry Nation to write it, and they had somewhat of a free rein to go away and do what they wanted, and the script editor's role was essentially to make sure that it was feasible to actually make that, maybe trim things down or add a bit of dialogue here and there, but there wasn't the same kind of control, I think. And as a result, I think classic Doctor Who has a lot more influences, because you've got more minds in a way contributing to the end product.
Yeah.
So definitely, yeah.
Because the humor,
there are periods, of course, where the influences are much more apparent than others. In the Tom Baker era, the early Tom Baker era, it's like a different Hammer horror movie every week kind of thing.
Well, it's because, especially in thinking back and just looking at a few clips over the last few weeks, but after I contacted you, was the Charters and Caldecott humor was basically based on the humor of misunderstanding. You know, that's a donut. What is it? Does it have a nut? No, a donut. What's it? You know, that kind of thing. And I remember, especially with the helpers that the early Doctor had, you'd sometimes get that, where the Doctor was all knowing and he was constantly explaining the mishaps and misunderstandings that the travelers had with him. I want to give a second one, though, an American thing. And I don't know, an American influence. And it's also a fictive character that was a doctor. And I don't know if you're familiar with the pulp fiction of the 30s and 40s in America. But usually this character is associated with superheroes like Superman and Batman and whatnot. And that is Doc Savage. I don't know if you've ever heard of the character Doc Savage.
I've heard the name, definitely.
Because Doc Savage was basically a savant who had a series of helpers, and in every story, the helpers would have to be rescued by Doc Savage almost. And back in the 1960s, when I was, well, I was born in 65, but by the early 70s, I think the Del Rey Publishing here in the U.S. re-released them with paintings by a guy named, I think it was James Bama, which became iconic. And right around that time was when Doctor Who was coming along. So I'm just wondering if there was Doc Savage, the guy who knew everything and was constantly saving his companions, might have been an influence. So I don't know if you may want to check him out.
I think so. I mean, maybe there's a connection there. I've never.
Now, Doc Savage was a rippling, strong guy. He wasn't an old guy. He was the man of bronze, who later became the man of steel, Superman. But I'm just wondering if.
Well, I mean, it certainly might well have been an influence, because those early days when the premise was sort of being drawn up, the first writer, who is kind of forgotten about a lot of the time, was a man called Anthony Coburn, and he wrote the initial story. But very much the premise of the show and the characterizations, I think, were essentially Sidney Newman, who was a Canadian broadcaster. So I think when it came to his exposure to American culture, his would have been far greater than a lot of perhaps than the British writers at the time. And he was brought in by the BBC to kind of energize their programming and really introduce a load of ideas and shake things up a little bit. And so, you know, he might well have brought that in. I can see him as being someone who would immerse himself in different cultural things like that. And certainly coming from, you know, North America, it might well take a lot of influence from those things.
Now, I don't want to recap the stuff that you've done in your videos, so I just recommend people to watch the videos for the more details. So I don't want to necessarily go into how each of the actors got hired and whatnot. So I want to just sort of stick more with the cultural milieu and talk about a few of the stories in the first Doctor's era. Number one, I do want to ask, though, one of the unique features of Doctor Who was the serial format rather than episodic television. You know, a standalone episode initially in the initial run. You'd have 3 or 4 or 6 parters. Was that done specifically for a reason, or you know, or did it just come about as a function of the storytelling?
I think that for British television at the time, it wasn't unusual. I think on the one hand, it makes more financial sense because the nature of Doctor Who, of course, means that you have to change essentially your cast, apart from your main 4 actors every few weeks. You have to change the sets and designs, and you go into alien planets a lot of the time, so you can't rely on the costume department to provide you with, you know, pre-existing things that you can hire. So I think financially it makes sense to do stories which have several installments to them. And originally the audience were probably far less aware than we are now of which story was which. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of, in those days there wasn't episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. They all had individual titles, and at the end of a lot of them, you know, the end of that particular story as we know of it, they did tend to segue into the start of the next one. So the audience kind of almost saw it as that rolling serial, much like soaps.
Yeah.
I think in England, soap television is much different to that. In America, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of soaps in America are seen as very cheap daytime programs that are kind of watched by bored housewives.
And there's only 4 of them in the daytime now left on the 3 major networks, so it's a dying art form.
Yeah, well, in England, it has always been. I mean, I'm not a big fan of soap as we would normally classify it, but mainly because I find everyday, you know, stories set in the everyday world a bit too banal. Yeah. But things like EastEnders and Coronation Street, which have been running for a while, I believe, when Doctor Who started, are still the biggest programs of the week. They regularly get 14 million viewers or so. That, you know, people are, and that is an ongoing storyline, and the production is continuous. Yeah. There aren't seasons as such. And Doctor Who, when it began, was filmed in the same way. I think they basically worked at, I think something like 40 odd weeks a year. And that meant that, much like in a soap where you've got a big cast of characters, so sometimes you won't see a character for a story and the actor was probably on holiday or something. In Doctor Who, you've got that as well. Sometimes William Hartnell would be incapacitated for a story because William Hartnell was on holiday or something that week. So it was very different to how television programs are made these days. I don't think it was a conscious narrative decision, other than financially, to do it in that episode, in that serialized format. I think that was just the way a lot of program was made then. I think probably the other big program that had been on before was a program called Dixon of Dock Green, which was sort of a police serialized program. And there's kind of a nod to that in the very first episode, because the very first episode begins with a shot of a British bobby walking through the fog of London, and that was very much like Dixon of Dock Green. And then that was followed by a show called Z-Cars, which was another police procedural sort of thing. And they were all like this. They had contained stories as such, but you know, it was like an ongoing storyline that the viewers were not meant to recognize that it was a different story each time.
Well, let me ask then about the first Dr. Hartnell, and let me start by a specific episode or arc that I remember very much, because I remember it was like early 80s. I was at one of my parents' friends' homes. We didn't have color TV. They did. And I remember on PBS here, there was an episode called The Gunfight, or an arc. And I watched the whole 2 hours or whatnot. And I looked at, and I remember seeing that because it's the OK Corral, it's the American West. I had seen stuff, even The Prisoner, which I think for me is the greatest show of all, with only 17 episodes. But even they had a Western, but it wasn't as good. And I remember in my mind, before I watched clips of it, it had such a German expressionistic feel. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. You have the gunfighters, the shadows, the canted angles. It really stuck in my mind, and I watch a few clips on. I don't think have the whole episode on YouTube, and I think it's good. I look online, and it's one of the worst reviewed episodes ever. And I'm like, I don't get it. I mean, is it just because it was American, or because it was another thing? I mean, I think it's an excellent episode.
Well, I mean, there's a story, you know, there's stories that I really like that are generally thought of as subpar as well, and it really comes down to the individual. I think sometimes the idea of received wisdom is a little bit, I kind of reject that a little bit, because despite being a fan, I've never really felt like but I didn't grow up amongst fandom, you know. Like nowadays, when people become fans of things, they congregate and think, and that's lovely and that's great. But sometimes I think it breeds a kind of a uniformity of thought. Um, and there are stories which everyone thinks are amazing and you can't question it, and there are stories that a lot of people think are not so good, and you can't say that you like them. So, you know, if you enjoy, people that enjoy the gunfights, that's fine. Personally, I don't like it, and I think the reason why a lot of people don't like it is that it's supposed to be a comedy episode and somewhat of a musical as well. There are not moments like you would have in a musical where people sort of just start singing and dancing and it breaks the reality, but there are moments of song and dance, which is meant to be amusing, and the song in particular gets a bit grating after a while. It's quite it's sort of one song and it's just played through all the episodes, and it's quite annoying. So I think that's a part of it. But I agree with you, actually. I mean, the Gunfighters the production design is great.
And Star Trek did Star Trek in America did an OK Corral episode that's really not good. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's terrible, but it's one of the lesser episodes. And I remember when I saw this, I was like, boy, that's way better than the Star Trek version of OK Corral.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, when they were trying to bring Doctor Who back in the 90s with Paul McGann, it went through a process where they were going to reboot the program, and kind of in the sort of series Bible they put together to propose the series to prospective investors, they did a few synopses of different stories, and they basically plundered all the back catalogue. And the Gunfighters was the one that John Leakley, who wrote the Bible, really was taken by, and actually went so far to write pages of script for it. So I think, you know, you're not the only one that's been struck by it. He really wants to bring that one back.
I'm not saying necessarily that it's great television, and as you wisely point out in one of your videos, that you have to look at old television as more related to stage than modern television. And,
certainly British television, yeah.
I could see the Gunfighters being produced as a stage play. You know, you could cut it down from the 2.5 running hours or whatever it is down to 90 minutes or something. But anyway, that was my thought regarding him. As I said, I don't want to recap all of the doctors and how they came in. So if you have a final comment about Hartnell, let's move on to Troughton. Do you have a final comment about Hartnell?
I think, well, one of the things that's interesting about William Hartnell, and why I think newer fans find it sometimes difficult to get into it, is because that was perhaps the core concept of the show is there, but the character of the Doctor as William Hartnell was an evolving thing, and it's only really in his successor where our familiar ideas of the Doctor is set. And he was a very different type of character. He wasn't initially the hero. He wasn't initially supposed to be the main protagonist, although he was wise and intelligent and educated. So yeah, he is unique by virtue of the fact that his Doctor is very different in some respects to later ones, although that has led sometimes, I think, to misunderstandings, and it's quite controversial. In a much later story that was done a few years ago, they had William Hartnell's Doctor in it, and the way in which he was written was, a lot of people find it quite maybe disrespectful to William Hartnell, in the fact that they make him this sort of very old-fashioned 1960s sexist sort of chauvinist, which that the first Doctor wasn't. He does show a lot of those traits that we come to define as the Doctor, but it was really with Patrick Troughton, really, that I think the core idea of the Doctor was really crystallized.
Now that's interesting, because Pertwee was the first Doctor I saw, then Baker, and the rest. I saw Troughton in a few of the Doctor compilation of the 5 Doctors or the 3 Doctors, whatever it was. And I maybe have seen 1 or 2 of the black and white episodes of Troughton. And compared to Pertwee and Baker, and maybe it's because I think they were so stellar, to me, Troughton has always just seemed like I think you called him the Charlie Chaplin, the tramp version of the Doctor. He just seems such a lightweight in comparison. So what? I know you're a fan, of Troughton, but so tell us who don't know as much about that era.
Well, one of the issues, of course, with that period is the fact that the BBC, in those days when they made programming, once it was shown, it was hardly likely ever to be shown again. And they didn't predict the marketability of home media. You know, it was a pie in the sky idea that one day people would want to buy DVDs, and when they did, it would be of a show that was on 50 years ago that they knocked out in an evening. So a lot of Patrick Troughton's era doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. You know, bits and pieces have been discovered since. So I think a lot of what makes him appealing as a Doctor and his era to a lot of people is the unknown, really. You know, we have snippets, we have audios, we have still images, but we don't have all his stories. So I think that's a part of the appeal. He's appealing in that way because you want to kind of discover who he really was and what his stories were. But he is one of my favourite incarnations, and the reason for that is that, and I think this is something that they got wrong later on in those stories that you mentioned, in the multi-Doctor anniversary stories, the 3 Doctors, the 5 Doctors, the 2 Doctors, all of which have Patrick Troughton in. He's in it, and his performance is great, but the writing of his character very much is as that kind of cheeky Charlie Chaplin-esque character, whereas when you see his original stories, yes, that is there, but there is an underside to it. It very much appears and becomes apparent in certain scenes that is not a facade as such, it's a genuine part of his personality, but there's a deeper, darker side to him and a sense of responsibility, very much that he's sort of lulling his enemies into a false sense of security with his buffoonery, to then sort of twist the knife and defeat them. So I think that in those original stories, and that is helped somewhat by the way that the programs were shot in that period, with the black and white, and the Troughton era starts to get a lot more influence from horror movies and invasion movies, becomes a bit more cinematic in its production style than perhaps the Hartnell era, and so that helps to lend that kind of darker, deeper feeling, which in the bright white lights of 1970s and 80s Doctor Who is somewhat lost, I think, the nuance of his character.
Well, before I move on to talk about the Pertwee and Baker 70s, basically, and they were basically the 2 dominant Doctors of that era, which I was a preteen and teen when I first watched it, because I think the bicentennial year of 76 was when I think Doctor Who first came to the U.S. I could be wrong. But I did want to...
Well, that sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, I did want to go back, though, something I overlooked. And I had mentioned The Prisoner and Patrick McGowan. Danger Man was a big hit, became secret agent over here. The Avengers, I remember as a kid watching them. And, you know, when I watched those shows, the American versions, like Mission Impossible versus The Avengers, they always seem to be a little bit less. Danger Man, I finally got the DVD set of it a few years ago, and it's an outstanding show. Prisoner, again, I've mentioned. Doctor Who came about a little bit before that era, but did it ever go through sort of a psychedelic period? Was the Troughton years a bit of the psychedelic Avengers and Prisoner?
I would say that it would probably be more John Pertwee where the show started to take influence more explicitly from other television programs and films. Towards the end of the Patrick Troughton era, the popularity of the program had declined a little bit, as is natural, I suppose, for a program that was 6 years into its run. I mean, we think that as a very tiny period in the show, but 6 years for any other program, and normally a program would be looking to end.
Yeah.
And going into the 1970s, they knew that they were going to be filming and transmitting in colour, although a lot of people in Britain at that time didn't have colour television, but they were still getting ready for it, filmed much like high definition has been over the last few years.
Yeah.
And along with that, they thought, well, we need to really shake this up. And so that was when they kind of went back to the drawing board, and they kept the fundamental aspects of the show, but they looked at other things like Quatermass. They looked at things like the more high octane action shows, like you mentioned, like the Avengers and things like that, and thought, well, we need to redesign this somewhat. And also there was a budgetary concern, because it's very, very expensive to have a program which changes its location and its cast of characters and actors every few weeks. And so they filmed a lot of things. They made the Doctor be exiled to Earth and become the scientific advisor to a military unit. So you'd have an extended cast that were regulars. And John Pertwee himself, despite having a background as a kind of a comic actor, was someone who was very interested in physical action. He was someone who loved fast cars and bikes, and right up until he was reasonably elderly, you know, he was always interested in those kinds of things. And as all the actors, he brought that elements into his character, and so that then influenced the show. So it became more in the vein of that kind of James Bond-esque thing. And of course, by that point, James Bond had done, 4 films or so, I think. They may have done a 5th by 1970, I'm not sure. But that had really become the popular thing at the time, of fast cars and agents and political intrigue. And so you get elements like that coming in. You have, you know, summits with the UN having a peace summit, and someone's trying to undo it. And then you have the Moriarty character of the Master as his foil coming in, and you did have that more element. The music had always been synthesized and electronic, and was very pioneering at the beginning, but it kind of went overboard almost in the early 70s. You mentioned psychedelic, and must admit, there's a story with John Pertwee called The Claws of Axos, and the music in that is almost, for me, I know people will love it, but it's kind of like fingers on a blackboard.
Well,
just the craziness of
what is that musical instrument that, you know, it's the
theremin.
The theremin, yeah.
Yeah, there were those elements, and they were just it was very experimental. I think the show has always been experimental. The BBC used the show, I think, a lot, and it had people who were interested in experimenting to try out different methods of filmmaking. And so in the 70s with John Pertwee, you get the advent of it using what the BBC called CSO, or colour separation overlay, which was sort of very early form of blue screen. And so that was done with mixed results. Sometimes they'd go a bit too far, and we talk about, you know, George Lucas and The Phantom Menace, and how, you know, he just wanted actors on a set that's surrounded by blue and there's nothing else there. But they actually did that in Doctor Who in the 1970s. There's a story called The Terror of the Autons, where a guy takes it's a famous scene, got lots of complaints. He takes his troll doll home, but it's actually an alien plastic monster, and it attacks him. And there's a shot of his wife who's in the kitchen. And for some reason, they didn't film it in a kitchen. Perhaps they didn't build the set, but they just put a kind of a blue screen kitchen behind her. So it was very ahead of its time in its experiments with different things. And obviously the title sequence itself was very experimental. When John Pertwee came in, obviously it was in colour. And so the way they achieved that effect for the William Hartnell, Patrick Troughton, and then John Pertwee was essentially to have a camera that was the result of what the camera was seeing was being shown through the monitor. And they would point the camera at the monitor, so you get this sort of feedback loop, and you get all these weird wavy lines and things. And so they did that, and then they colorized it. So the John Pertwee opening is these very bright pinks and greens, and it is very psychedelic for the period, I think. But at the same time, despite those changes and these evolutions and these experiments, it still kept true, I think, to that core idea of the Doctor. And I think that's part of the reason for that is partly because the notion of the Doctor, that character, and who he is something that I think is quite intrinsic to a lot of classic British literature. And the fact that I think a lot of people see him as somewhat unique now is evidence of the fact that a lot of our archetypal heroes now have become more, like you were saying, with the sort of the more strongman type character as the hero, as we've become somewhat Americanized, and I don't mean that with any disrespect, but in Britain,
Oh, disrespect. Go ahead.
the culture is well, because in the 80s in particular, America was, I suppose, where people looked for. It became the leader, much like I suppose the British Empire had been 100 years prior, had been kind of like the icon of, this is advanced, this is sophisticated. And so I remember when I was growing up, and there still is to some extent now, where you'll walk into a supermarket and it'll say American donuts. They've never been to America, these donuts, and I don't see why they're specifically, but they have the flag and things like that. So there's that icon, America is cool. And so I think in a lot of popular culture as well, with the success of things like Star Wars and Star Trek and things like that, a lot of American archetypal characters have been adopted into British culture. So the Doctor, whilst being influenced by that, definitely, that he's still true to that classic British literary character, someone like Sherlock Holmes, for example.
Well, let me ask, there's a saying amongst Doctor Who fans that your favorite Doctor is always the first Doctor you saw. And Pertwee was the first Doctor that I saw, but he wasn't my favorite because I think I only saw maybe 2 or 3 arcs when he came over. And I think when it came to the U.S. On public television here, after the first month, there was Tom Baker, and Tom Baker was not the ass kicker that John Pertwee was. And I remember the first time I saw Pertwee with the white hair, I said, oh, this is an old guy. And then he's got this gigantic personality. I was like, boy, this is pretty cool. And then you go almost 180 degrees to this big guy, Tom Baker, but he's sort of this nebbishy, odd kind of guy. And it was just such an interesting transition. But those are my 2 favorite Doctors because they are the first 2 that I saw. But I do favor Baker a little bit. But the thing that in watching it stuck out is Pertwee seemed to have a lot more film in his episodes, whereas Baker was more videotape on the cheap sets and whatnot. Whereas you get more of Pertwee motoring around and running through woods and whatnot. Was film actually cheaper than video back in that day? Was that one of the reasons?
No, I think it's more virtue of the fact that at that time, and there's even a joke in a Monty Python sketch about this at one point, where if you were to film on location in British television, you tended to use a film stock. I'm not entirely sure of the whole reasons why. I think it was just due to the technology and the power and things like that. But then when you were on set, they used videotape. And so you get stories quite frequently in British television right up until the mid to late 80s, where everyone's on set and they're being filmed on 50 frames per second videotape, and then they'll step outside and suddenly we've gone into film. And so there's this Monty Python sketch where they're on a board meeting and it's all on a set, and they open the window and they go, oh, gentlemen, we're surrounded by film, because there was this jarring sort of change. And I think why it perhaps is more noticeable in John Pertwee's era is because he was exiled to Earth, there's a lot more location filming, and so there's more video, film used. And when it had come to Tom Baker's era, they'd kind of gone back to the science fiction being away. But you'll notice any time where they're in an exterior, like the famous Doctor Who quarries that stand in for alien planets or elsewhere, you'll notice the film being used. And that with one exception, by Tom Baker's time, they had worked out the technology had developed where they could have outside broadcast vans that could show videotape, and they didn't do it for his old era. I think they did it for his very first story. So rather than it having these 2 types, it's all on videotape. And I think film, obviously film makes things look a bit more cinematic. But they're going to settle on the videotape because I think the videotape overall was cheaper because you didn't have to process it on. You could reuse it, record over it and things like that. Later on, when it got to the sort of Sylvester McCoy era, they did away with I think the very last story that actually used film on location was a Colin Baker story, a Dalek one. So after that, everything's shot on videotape because they had the technology to film it there. There were some issues throughout the 70s, particularly in John Pertwee's time, where there was a lot of strike action at the BBC over different union disputes, and therefore some stories that were to be filmed in studio ended up having to be filmed on location because they couldn't, literally, the doors were locked, they couldn't go into the studio. So his very first story, Spearhead from Space, is shot entirely on film, and it's markedly different visually because it's a whole film, and because of that you can get it on Blu-ray, and it is genuine Blu-ray because rather than upscale, because it was a film stock that it was shot on. So
well, let me turn before we talk a bit about some of the Baker era and some of Pertwee's stories. I do want to step back a moment to talk about the technology portrayed in the series, the TARDIS being the most obvious one, and you get kind of sneering condescension from a lot of sci-fi fans over the cheapness of that. But I think it was Arthur C. Clarke who said any significantly advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic. And so when I look at the old Star Trek, for example, with the simple phasers and just the buttons and not a lot of the tech that you'd see, like when the movie Alien came out, this huge hulking cargo ship, and now in modern Star Trek and everything, you see everything looks so super digital now. But it would seem to me that thousands of years an advanced society, thousands of years in advance of ours, isn't going to need starships. They're going to have a little thing like a TARDIS where you can fold time and space, and it's going to be nice and neat, and things are just going to be a sonic screwdriver. You're not going to have these huge hulking things. The technology is going to be compressed, and when you get something like in Star Trek, the Q continuum or the Time Lords, they may actually be technological beings that just look like their natural flesh and blood. So I think while there certainly were cheesy effects in this 1970s, I think the shrinking and the simplicity actually makes it look more futuristic and more modern to me than a lot of the tech that when you see it's high budget tech in the 1980s, the Next Generation Star Trek, to me looks a lot more dated.
Yeah. I think it does. Nothing, I think, ages a kind of fictional,
keep it simple,
prospective future better than trying to a few years later. Sometimes they get it spot on, but it's still going to age. I mean, I remember when Minority Report first came out, obviously with Spielberg and a massive budget behind it, and everyone was wowed by some of the technology. But now it's not really surprising. I was watching.
Why would you need to have the things that move in the middle of the air?
I mean, what's the purpose of gloves anymore? You can just do it with your hands. So that in itself has dated it. And I was watching Star Trek recently, 90s Star Trek, Next Generation, and I sort of trying to cast my mind back and remember how amazed I was by the little pads that they have, which are essentially iPads.
Yeah.
And now I was watching, I sort of caught myself just accepting it as relatable technology and not futuristic technology, because we have that technology now. So I think you're right. Sometimes making it more mysterious and not always explaining it and having, all the buttons and what do they do? I mean, some fans want to know everything about everything, and people have, worked it out. But at the time, it was just the magic box that took people places. I mean, the quality of the production. I mean, the original set wasn't cheap by any measure. In fact, the whole set that was built for the very first story for the TARDIS interior, which is a lot more in it than what came later, because it was designed to be modular and could be pulled apart and moved around, and you could use sections of it and not use the full section, dependent on the wider need of the studio. And over time, bits disappeared and you never saw them again. But that original first reveal, there's quite a lot to it. And I know intimately all about it because I've just been recreating it in CGI for a later video that I'm going to do. And I ended up just in the CG element having over 6,000 separate geometric objects to try and make this room the way it had been in the 60s. And I think it cost, I can't remember exactly how much it cost, but I know that the cost of the original TARDIS set is pretty much the equivalent amount of money in today's money when you adjust for inflation as the modern set for current Doctor Who costs, which has obviously got a far larger budget prospectively. So it was, for the time, quite advanced, I think. But I think you're right. They didn't set out necessarily to present a kind of logical futuristic technology, because they were supposed to be not in the near future, and it wasn't supposed to be an attainable technology. It was supposed to be, as you say, that kind of indistinguishable from magic. And in fact, that has been played upon several times in Doctor Who stories, when they go back into history and someone encounters their technology and thinks that there was, in fact, the very first story was that they went back to 100,000 BC and then bumped into some cavemen, and they want the Doctor to give them the secret of fire. So it was very much that idea of technology used and abused in the wrong hands, and the power of that technology, but also with that same mysterious quality of awe. I think that was what they were trying to evoke, a certain sense of awe.
Yeah. Well, because we've talked so much, I want to just try to move a little bit more quickly into the 80s and also to the modern show, because you're 6 hours ahead of me and you're probably getting tired. So I do want to talk, though, about, I want to just mention briefly 4 episodes of the Baker era that stood in my mind that I purposely didn't look up because I want to just get your opinion of it. There was an episode that I remember with Baker set in a lighthouse where I think people were disappearing. And I think it's based on a famous sci-fi story. What was the episode? And am I correct? Is it based on a famous?
It's one of my all-time favorites, and it was a great shame I couldn't put it in my video. I chose a different one in the end, but it's called Horror Fang Rock.
Okay.
And it's partly inspired by a true story of the fire. There were some lighthouse keepers in a remote part of Britain years ago, in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And there were just 2, because the rules said you could have 2 lighthouse keepers, and no one's quite sure, I think, what happened. They ended up killing each other and one, but no one quite knows exactly how it happened. They went crazy.
Yeah.
And so after that, they changed the rules, so you have to have 3 lighthouse keepers now. So if the 2 go insane, the other one can get help or something.
Yeah.
But that came about partly because the writer of that, Terrance Dicks, who sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago, and he was a massive part of Doctor Who and really forged a lot of that Pertwee era and then leading into Tom Baker. He was commissioned to write that story by the script editor at the time, a guy called Robert Holmes, who is arguably one of the best Doctor Who writers ever. And he'd got the job of script editor following Terrance Dicks, who had been script editor before. And whilst Terrance Dicks had been script editor, he had commissioned Robert Holmes to make a story which was set in medieval times. It's the only John Pertwee story where he goes back into history, and it introduces the Sontarans. Yeah. And Robert Holmes was really, really annoyed by this. I can't remember why. It's a fantastic story. I love that one as well, called The Time Warrior. And he had said, you're going to have to, it's got to be set back in time, and you've got to have some alien in it, and the Doctor goes back in time and introduces a companion. Robert Holmes had been really annoyed by this commission. And so when he became script editor, he then commissioned Terrance Dicks. He said, right, you've got to do a story set in the past, and it's all stuck in a lighthouse. And Terrance Dicks went away and said, because he's like trying to get his own back on him. Yeah. And so he wrote Horror Fang Rock, which I think is such a fantastic story because it has that claustrophobia of, they are stuck in the lighthouse or on the rocks. Yeah. There's an alien that's hunting them down. It has that kind of haunted house feel. Yeah. That was later done in Alien. It is very much like Alien in the sense of, you've got this unknowable creature who you don't see, who keeps picking people off. But then you've got that added element of the alien can take the form of people. So you've got that kind of paranoia, that Cold War sort of paranoia that you get in things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and things. And yeah, it's a really, really good story.
2 of them you did do in your docs, and I'll let people look at your documentaries for them. One was the Satan Set story about the Satan on Earth.
Pyramids of Mars, yeah.
And then the other one was the one with the humans in hypersleep and the bug people that want to destroy them.
In space.
Yeah, and that actually reminded me, I don't know if you've ever seen, Keir Dullea, who's in 2001, was in a 1973 sci-fi show in America called The Star Lost. I don't know if you've ever seen that show. It was very Tom Baker-ish in its cheesy effect. It was actually written by, what's his name? Was it Philip K. Dick, or who's the other argumentative asshole sci-fi writer? Harlan Ellison. No, Harlan Ellison was the guy. He scripted the show. It didn't get funded, and it's been forgotten. But that episode with the Ark reminded me very much of the show called The Star Lost, which is about this giant ship with the remnants of humanity in these separate biospheres, and they don't know the other biospheres exist. You can find all 17 episodes online. Just put in The Star Lost, Kia Delay. You can find all 17 episodes. That might be something that interests you.
No, I wouldn't be surprised if that was a direct influence on it.
And the fourth Baker one that I just wanted to mention was, I don't know the name of it, but there's a creature that goes back 4.5 billion years into Earth's history and wants to change it or something. And most of the show is set with just the TARDIS on this blank early Earth.
I think you might be thinking of two stories there. The first one I think you're thinking of is called City of Death, and it was written by, I've since been angrily corrected by people. It's commonly believed to be mainly written by Douglas Adams, famous for writing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But the idea of it was actually someone else's, and he kind of went with that. And that involves a story. There's an alien back in prehistory in primordial Earth on a spaceship who his ship explodes, and he essentially gets split throughout time.
That's right, he's split. That's it.
So he then is trying to engineer a situation through these different.
Isn't he also in classical Rome, the character? Classical Rome of Greece? Isn't one of his split personalities or split beings ends up in Greece or something?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think they go there. There's a montage that you see in the different periods, like ancient Egypt. He goes back to see Leonardo da Vinci. Right. He's there, and he was played by the great Julian Glover, who's still going. He was in Game of Thrones, that was one of the first not only location film stories, but one shot abroad. It was shot in Paris, so there's quite a lot of film shot of Tom Baker and his soon-to-be wife Lala Ward running around Paris.
And Lala,
so that's very fondly.
Lala Ward played Romana, right? Lala Ward was Romana, or the second Romana?
Yes, and they...
Was she the sexy one or the cute one?
I don't know. She was the short blonde one. Yeah, she's married to Richard Dawkins now.
Right, and she was and she was a Time Lord or Time Lady, would they call them? Okay.
Yeah, well, at that time they said Time Lady, yes. The first Romana came in played by Mary Tam. Yeah. She was very tall, long, dark hair. But after her first year, she moved on. And then they cast Lala Ward, who had been a character in that era of Tom Baker. And so they kind of contrived it so that Romana chose to look like her and regenerate into her. And then she was there pretty much up until the end of Tom Baker's era. She left in his sort of just before his penultimate story. And then after she left the program, Tom Baker and her had a short marriage. But it was on City of Death, apparently, where they kind of fell in love in Paris, which is appropriate, I suppose. But I think the other story that you're thinking of is the one that I featured in my video, which is called Warrior's Gate, which is actually that Romana's final story. She leaves at the end of that, as does K9. And that was the original concept of it was very kind of out there. And I think it's realised quite well for the time, but there was a lot of difficulties in bringing that to the screen. But I think that's a really good story, and it's always struck me because when I was young, as I said, I didn't Doctor Who was not on television, and so when I got to see it, it was usually because of a special repeat or something. And there was a Doctor Who weekend for the 30th anniversary in 1993 on a digital television channel. For some reason, rather than showing the 4 episodes of a particular serial, they just picked random ones. And one of the episode shows was episode 4 of Warrior's Gate. So I watched it and I had no idea what was going on because it was the very last episode and I didn't know who the characters were or anything. But it was very interesting, and that's the one with the white void that has just a spaceship in it, and because it's they're trying to break through back into our universe and things.
I probably mixed the two of them up.
Interesting visual ideas there, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things with Doctor Who, even more so than Star Trek, and especially more so than the 80s Star Trek Next Generation, which was 2PC, is despite what you might say about the gadgets and whatnot. There were ideas there, and the actors bought into it. You never got the sense that, oh, I'm in a cheap show, I'm just going to throw the scarf over my. That Tom Baker and Pertwee especially
Yeah.
bought, even if there was the most ridiculous looking monster, you got a sense that they bought it. So let's talk about the post Tom Baker. There's two Bakers, Colin Baker era. The 1980s Doctor Who. I remember when Tom Baker left here in the U.S. Doctor Who really sort of shriveled a bit. At least in New York, when I was a kid growing up, it became much harder to see. It went from, I remember the Doctor Who era from Pertwee and Baker were on PBS from like 10 to midnight. They'd do a 4-episode arc on Saturdays or Sunday nights. And then it moved to maybe 2 a.m. I think at one time they did the same thing with another show that I loved called Prisoner Cell Block H from Australia, with women in prison.
Yeah.
They moved that from like 11 o'clock, which was late enough for me as a kid, to like 2 in the morning. But anyway, it seemed to me that, especially when watching your videos about Peter Davison, Colin Baker, and then Sylvester McCoy, is that it seemed they seemed to suffer from, I guess you call it coitus interruptus almost. Is that just as their doctors were hitting their stride or getting their feet on it, the rugs were pulled out under all three actors. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
I think that's certainly true for Colin Baker. And the rug pretty much was yanked out from under him. I think Peter Davison could have carried on, but he'd decided to move on. I think there was a point in his second season where he thought that it wasn't really for him anymore, and he didn't feel like. I think Peter Davison would admit. Actually, I met him again earlier today, although I didn't talk to him about this. He's a great part of the show and has been very loyal and has done many things for the show since. But I think he'd be the first to admit that Doctor Who, it's probably, if it's on, it's not necessarily the thing that he would watch as an adult. He's not like, say, David Tennant, who is an actual fan of the program, So, he had done. There was several. He had bumped into Patrick Troughton when he was first cast as Doctor Who, and Patrick Troughton had warned him, do 3 years and then leave. Patrick Troughton was quite famously very frightened of typecasting, and Peter Davison had a very successful career and had been cast as the Doctor, and I think he was worried that he would not be able to continue that momentum following Doctor Who, and I think his worries were well founded, because he did endure a bit of a slump in his career following Doctor Who. So they were never, all of those Doctors, with the exception perhaps of Colin Baker, because he was essentially fired from the show. They all did a run which is similar to William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton. They'd done 3 years. I think the big difference, of course, is that by that point they weren't making as many episodes a year.
Yeah.
So when we look back, they actually have done fewer stories than the early ones. But at the time, they had been, Peter Davison was the Doctor for 3 years. Colin Baker was the Doctor for about 2.5 years, because there was a big hiatus in the middle. He did 2 seasons. And then Sylvester McCoy was the Doctor for 3 years and would have continued on into a 4th year had the show not been cancelled. So their eras are similar to the earlier ones. I think the big thing is, because Tom Baker was the Doctor for 7 years and he had become so definitive. And of course, we've got to remember that at that time, certainly in Britain, you rarely saw any programming again. It was on that night and that was it. You couldn't catch up with it later, and in fact, until the mid to late 80s, video recorders were not affordable for most people. So for everyone, really, 7 years of him being, by 1979, 1980, there weren't that many people who really remembered the classic era, or if they did, they had memories which were obviously fuzzy with time and embellished by different things. So I think that made it difficult for the new Doctors, as I think any beloved incarnation of a particular character, when they move on, people find it difficult to accept the next guy, like Batman or the Joker, or any of these other characters that are frequently revisited. It's not the same as the Doctor, because obviously he is regenerating, but it's the same in the sense of a new actor playing the same part,
Yeah.
or James Bond, for example. So I think they suffered somewhat from that comparison. I think also another factor was at that point, science fiction had become very popular again globally due to things like Star Wars. And there were a lot of production companies were putting a lot of money into films that have now gone down as, you know, legends of the genre, both on the big screen but on the small screen as well. And so there were a lot of programs being imported to British television from America. I mean, certainly towards, you know, you had Star Trek, which had been made in the 60s but was shown in England. And obviously, despite what we were saying earlier, the production value of Star Trek seemed to be much higher than that of Doctor Who. And I think that superficial element for a lot of people is important. I think people started to see it as a bit cheap. And the BBC didn't really like it anymore. The people at the top, they weren't particularly fond of the programme. And later on, towards the mid-80s, towards the late 80s, they were actively hostile towards the programme and tried to axe it in a kind of arrogant way, assuming that you know, people didn't really like this show and people didn't really want science fiction because they didn't like it themselves. Specifically, two men, Jonathan Powell and Michael Grade, who were very high up. One was the controller of the BBC, and one became the controller of the BBC. So there wasn't much sympathy from above, and it went through there was a lot of interference in the program. I think there were a lot of efforts to essentially get the producer to quit, but he knew that if he quit, the BBC were not going to find a new producer to get to come in. I think John Nathan Turner wanted to move on. He had a lot of ideas and projects, but he felt a loyalty to the program, even if a lot of fans believe he made poor decisions. I think we've got to respect the fact that we wouldn't have had those last 4 years or so if he hadn't stayed, because if he had walked out, then the BBC would have just axed the program. But it was still very, very financially fruitful for the BBC. I mean, it to this day, but even then, it was probably their biggest export. And the thing about BBC profits when it comes to selling things overseas or merchandise and all that is because the BBC is not a corporate entity like, say, Fox or someone.
Yeah.
Any money that a program generates goes back into the BBC, not necessarily into the program that generated the money, but into the BBC as a whole. So all the other programming at the time, the soaps, the dramas that they were making, were financially benefiting and have continued to financially benefit from the niche that Doctor Who was fulfilling. So I think it was a bit short-sighted to get rid of it when they did, but that was their agenda, really.
And Colin Baker was the last Doctor that I saw full arcs of. When Sylvester McCoy came on, I think, at least in the New York area where I was living, it was very difficult to see any Doctor Who, so I might have seen just 1 or 2 episodes. You relate him to Troughton, and in that sense, they are the two classic Doctors that I've seen the least of. And you said they were very similar characters?
Yeah, I think to some extent, Sylvester McCoy was very influenced, I think, just generally as a performer. He had a background in sort of physical comedy. He was very much influenced by Buster Keaton. And so he brings that similar kind of silent film slapstick physicality to the role that Troughton did as well.
Well, let me just ask you something. Let me just pick up on that, because I'm a silent film fan. I'm actually looking to do a show on the silent film era soon. And there's always the Keaton versus Chaplin thing. And I'm pro Chaplin because even though Chaplin could get a little bit mawkish and sentimental, when you re-watch something like The General, Keaton's most famous film, it's just a series of gags. There's no character development. There's nothing like in The Circus even, or The Gold Rush, where you get a development of the character and you have emotional moments that ring true. So to me, I've always thought Chaplin was greater than Keaton. we compared, or you, I think, in your docs compared Troughton more to the Charlie Chaplin. So was Troughton more Chaplin and McCoy more Keaton in terms of emotion?
I think some people would say that. Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that Patrick Troughton was perhaps a more accomplished actor than Sylvester McCoy. It kind of pains me to say that because I love Sylvester McCoy, but I would say that Troughton, but being a character actor, was more chameleonic than perhaps Sylvester McCoy can be. But Sylvester McCoy is quite a unique individual anyway, a bit like Tom Baker in the sense that what he brought to the role was very of his person. He has an interesting way of speaking. He has a Scottish accent, but it's quite a unique, light Scottish lilting accent, and he's quite different. And one of the issues with both Peter Davison and Colin is that they were very heavily interfered with in the sense of their look and some of their personality by John Nathan Turner, who, despite being, I think, a very savvy producer, was not a particularly good creator. And by the point that it got to, they were very contrived. I mean, you just have to look at Colin Baker's costume to see that that's a bold statement that doesn't quite fit really with the character that Colin Baker clearly wants to play. I think by the time McCoy's era, I think John Nathan Turner had learned somewhat to back off a little bit. And so even McCoy's outfit, I mean, the main thing, you can really see which part John Nathan Turner decided upon, which is the pullover with the question marks on. Yeah. All the rest of it fits, it looks more like clothes again. Eccentric clothes, but clothes like the original Doctors had rather than a costume. And the reason why I mention that is because I think Sylvester McCoy was allowed, therefore, to bring a lot more and therefore work into the scripts, more of his personality in that sense. I think Patrick Troughton, being a sort of a character actor, he completely inhabited the role. But I would say that a bit like Christopher Eccleston later on, he is performing. He is playing a character, not playing himself as such. Whereas Tom Baker and Sylvester McCoy are very much more. They're such eccentric individuals that in itself is unique and great for the Doctor. They're very different in a way. I mean, I think Sylvester McCoy and Patrick Troughton are similar on certain aspects: the eccentricity, the physical comedy, the buffoonish exterior at times. And this is perhaps even more marked in Sylvester McCoy's period, certainly his last two seasons. There's that darkness again there that was then taken up and developed when the show was off the air in the spin-off merchandise, how the story continued. They very much made him this kind of galactic chess player, despite being dressed as like this sort of eccentric British golfer from the 1930s. He's sort of like playing these monumental manipulative games with gods and evil monsters, as opposed to stumbling into adventure like the earlier Doctors had been. And so you get he's similar to Troughton in the sense that there is that superficial silliness on the outside, which actually shields the darker, deeper, wise, powerful Doctor character. And I think the size, the height, is also a reason why it's sort of comparable, because the Doctor had been quite tall, pretty much like you said, since John Pertwee, and then to have a much shorter stature character recalls immediately Patrick Troughton, I think.
Well, as we record this at the end of September of 2019, the most recent video of yours deals with what you call the wilderness years of the 90s, before the reboot or the retaking up of the series. And so I'm totally, I've not seen anything of it. So let me just ask, we could talk about some of the specific Doctors. You mentioned David Tennant. I guess he's sort of, you said, the modern version of Baker.
In the sense of his popularity.
And then I think
wider audience. Yeah.
And I think someone like Matt Smith is also probably number two, because when I look at the videos, they seem to have the most videos and the most liked videos of them.
I would say that amongst that wider audience, that Matt Smith was a worthy successor, I think. Yeah. I mean, I also think he was, but I mean in the sense of capturing whatever it is that those fans particularly appreciate. I think it's because they're both young and handsome, you know.
Now, there was an attempted reboot or a restart of the series in the mid-90s with a fellow named Paul
Mm.
McGann. And famously, Star Trek, the American show, tried to reboot in the mid-70s, and it ended up becoming the first Star Trek film,
Yeah.
the motion
Mm.
picture. So apparently, from what I took, that didn't really take. And was Paul McGann sort of trying to hunkify the Doctor? Because he was a good-looking guy. He wasn't this oddball kind of character.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of background really to that Paul McGann film,
Yeah.
Which I won't go too much into now. I think
Yeah, watch
that
your videos for the details.
yeah, I think that from the point of view of a casting decision on the look of Paul McGann, they definitely wanted a kind of an attractive, romantic lead rather than an old. You know, because it was essentially an American production. I'm not saying that British productions wouldn't do that now. I mean, you just have to look at the BBC's latest adaptation of Poldark and how pretty much every lady over a certain age in this country sees that as essential viewing. So, you know, that idea of the handsome, attractive male lead, I think in a way it was intended in some way to be reminiscent of the Hugh Grant popularity at that time internationally, as that kind of foppish character. But then saying that, I think despite the look of his character, Paul McGann brings and brought a bit more than that. He wasn't just that kind of superficial pretty boy as well. I think that's partly by virtue of the fact that he's a northerner, for one thing, unlike Hugh Grant, who's sort of posh southerner. And they tend to be a bit gruffer, a bit like Christopher Eccleston, who followed him. And I think that he wasn't entirely sure. Well, I know he wasn't entirely sure of taking on the role at the time because, again, like performers Peter Davis and Patrick Troughton, he was worried about typecasting, committing himself to long term. He liked to play very different characters. And if you look at his career up until then, you can see that quite clearly when you look at, he was in Alien 3. Unfortunately, most of his role in Alien 3 was cut out. But you compare that with, say, his role in Withnell and I, where he plays a sort of out-of-work actor who's quite hysterical with this psychopathic serial killer in Alien 3. You can really see his range of his performance abilities. And I think that one of the joys for a lot of people who've come to Doctor Who has been discovering how good Paul McGann is. At the time, his one outing as the Doctor served as a kind of a teasing idea of what could have been had the show continued. Fortunately, with the audio adventures, which are kind of an industry in themselves, Paul McGann has reprised that role and developed it further, and that's then opened up opportunities for him to return it in a form for a tiny sort of web episode that was done as part of the 50th anniversary.
Let me just ask something though. You mentioned these other ventures, and you mentioned them in your documentaries. Are they considered canon? You know, the books and the radio plays.
Well, not all of it. I mean, with any show like Doctor Who, and with the amount of material that's come out over the years, it's very difficult to have a consistent continuity. And there was never anyone who sat down and said, right, let's make sure this all works in the same way that perhaps Star Trek had from Next Generation onwards. So there are some things that are contradictory. The benefit of having people for the new series who are, and somewhat for the later years of the classic series as well, who had grown up with the show and were consumers of that multimedia, is that they, and some of them produced it themselves. I mean, some of the writers of the modern series wrote novels, and some of them actually, the new series are based on those novels, and those audios are inspired by them. So there's kind of a blurring of the lines between, you know, canon Doctor Who and spin-off non-canon. But when the 50th anniversary came along, there were a lot of projects alongside the special story that was made. One of which was a quick sort of 5 or 6 minute video with Paul McGann explaining how he had regenerated, so sort of drawing his era to an end because it had never really been on. But of course, when the new series started, we were beyond him, so there was kind of an unknown period where what had happened to the Eighth Doctor, and so there was this little video done, and in that when he, just before he regenerates, he says the names of all his companions, and all those companions had been his in the audios. So by doing that, the head writer essentially made all the audio adventures that until then, whether they were canon or not was debatable. It kind of made them canon.
Well, let me just go back then to the 60s. Is Peter Cushing's film and the Dalek films, is he considered a canon Doctor?
No.
No.
But the great thing about Doctor Who is that there's so many theories, and people love to come up with ways of explaining things and explaining out the different continuity. So there is a theory for how Peter Cushing fits into it. But the reason why the Peter Cushing Dalek films are not canon is because they were really Dalek films. The draw was the Daleks, and because they were the potential financially for them was so great that they want to make films. So they are adaptations of the first two Dalek stories. And the Doctor in that, as portrayed by Peter Cushing, is a kind of an elderly inventor who's human, and he's not an alien as such. The TARDIS is a police box, but the interior is not the magical box that we see. So it doesn't really fit because he's human. Although there are some theories about how it could be the Doctor, but in a parallel universe, or there is a later story where the Doctor turns himself into a human biologically, and so maybe it could be that. So people have fun working out these different things. So I do want to do a video on Peter Cushing at some point.
So in my own looking through some videos and other fan videos of the modern incarnation, which are, I believe, all episodic. It's no more serialization as in the classics, right? It's all 50-minute episodes.
There are 2 or 3 parters, but it's very much more in the established, 45-minute episode seasons, that 13 episode seasons that you get nowadays. Yeah,
because it seems to me that most people are of the opinion that the Eccleston, Tennant, Smith years are the modern classic ones, whereas Capaldi and now the first female Doctor, Jodie Whittaker, are the series going down the chute. Where do you fall in that spectrum? Just to give an overall view.
I don't really agree. I think the internet has a habit of amplifying dissent and those minority voices. I think that some of the most heartwarming things are seeing new generations discovering Doctor Who and being inspired by their Doctor. And I've seen so many. It's very heartening for someone who grew up with science fiction in the 90s, when it was very much a sort of a male preserve, or at least expected to be. And I myself was inspired so much by the character of the Doctor and what he stood for. To then see young girls dressed up as Jodie Whittaker going around conventions, and they're not the companion anymore. They're the lead. I think that's really amazing. And in fact, when I made my very first video, this was long before Jodie Whittaker had been cast, but there'd been rumblings about casting a female Doctor for years and years and years. And I said at the time that I felt that would be a shame from the point of view of the fact that the Doctor had always been a somewhat unique male role model, not a kind of muscle-bound hero who used his brain, and they didn't want to lose that. But I think that was a bit short-sighted on my part, because I thought, well, in retrospect, why can't a young boy also be inspired by Jodie Whittaker?
Well, that's the equivalent of the people who have been talking about Idris Elba being a black James Bond, right? I mean, So I mean,
sometimes it does come down to bigotry, but I think some people have got some valid points to make, but I think it gets amplified, and then it becomes somewhat fashionable. And so I would disagree. I think from the point of view of general popularity, you'd be right that certainly Tennant and Smith were kind of the most popular years. But I think that's also by virtue of the fact that it had come back, and that was its heyday. And if you look at other comparable series, say the X-Files or Star Trek or something like that, their run, or any show, Game of Thrones, well, let's not go there, other shows that have a significant amount of runtime and several series, their popularity and their appeal perhaps to a mass audience does tend to decline over the time. And so by the end of Matt Smith's era, the show had been back for about what,
Yeah.
8 or 9 years. I mean, that's quite a substantial period of time for a show. Unless you're a big fan of it, the general audience start going, well, it's more of the same. And although Doctor Who has somewhat of a unique format that it can regenerate the Doctor and change things up a little bit, it's still Doctor Who. So I think there's going to inevitably be a bit of a drop off. There's also the nature of consuming television is changing. A lot of people now will watch on digital devices and use catch up. The viewing figures for the Jodie Whittaker season are comparable to earlier ones, but in order to make that comparison, you do have to take into account other forms of watching television. And some people will say, well, that's not fair. You're just jigging the facts. But I think, well, no, that's a reflection of the fact that nowadays people do watch on their phones, or they'll catch up later or record. And if you don't take that into account, then you're not really moving with the times. I think obviously the last season of Doctor Who last year with Jodie Whittaker is quite polarizing. And I think you do have to try and cut through the misogyny and the general trend of SJWs are trying to ruin the world kind of thing, and try and get down to the core of people that are sensible and say, well, what are your concerns? It was a bit preachy at times. The Doctor had 3 companions, which hasn't really been done in a very long time since Peter Davison's era. And even then, as I said in my video at the time, I said the problem with having 3 companions and the Doctor is that you don't get as much screen time with the Doctor. The Doctor doesn't get as much opportunity to really develop the character. They become part of that ensemble. And so it happened with Peter Davison's Doctor, and I think it's happened somewhat with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor, is that she hasn't had enough of an opportunity because of the 3 companions ongoing storylines to really put her mark on it. But I think a lot of people what kind of frustrates me a little bit, and I think this is reflective of a wider cultural debate that's going on in movies and television and politics and everything, is that people think that Doctor Who, of all things, talking about issues of equality and of racism and gender identity and things like that, is somehow a new thing that's part of that movement, that it hasn't been in it since much, much earlier on. That kind of annoys me, because it's a bit disingenuous on the part, I think, of some fans, although I suppose I can forgive people that perhaps have only come to it recently, to just ignore it and say it's, a corruption. Because to me, and some would say that I know quite a lot about Doctor Who, I don't see it as particularly different to earlier Doctor Who. I mean, right from the beginning, we had a story, the very first Dalek story, the one that captured the imagination really of the world, was about intolerance, and it was about fascism, it was about equality and all these kinds of things.
Well,
so
it gets down to the writing, though. It gets down ultimately to the writing. I remember the Next Generation Star Trek in the 80s often got preachy, the first 2 years especially. And then when they got going in the 3rd or 4th season, they would do stories about, I remember one story about the android data. The Federation wanted to rip him apart. They didn't think him human, and that was a good episode. But it was good not because of what it was tackling, but how it tackled. And this is what I say to people all the time about art. Art is more of a verb than a noun. It's about how you do something. If all you want to do is a bumper sticker, make bumper stickers. If you want to make art, tell a good story, and if it's well written enough, you can sneak in little themes there, but do it that it's organic. If all you're doing is saying, "Oh, I'm against racism, I'm against nuclear war," well, okay, who is for nuclear war?
Yeah, that's true. I think that I think that this latest season perhaps wore its agenda, if you want to call it that, on its sleeve, perhaps a little bit too explicitly. But then I think there was I think there was some really, really good stories, some really good drama. It's changed the way they're using, I can't remember what they're called now, but they're using these lenses on the cameras, which lends the program a much more cinematic feel. Mm-hmm. It's got a different look to it. It has regenerated, just like all eras. And I think that there's an element of whenever a beloved main character changes, and I try to reflect this somewhat in my videos, that, for example, when Patrick Troughton first took over as William Hartnell, and as you say, he is generally regarded as one of the all-time greats now, but if you actually look back at the audience response at the time, obviously people didn't have Twitter and Facebook then, but the BBC used to do surveys, and they'd have points of view, and people would write in and say, and there were comments like, oh, he's too silly, oh, I won't be watching this, what have you done, you've ruined the Doctor, he used to be a clever person, now he's a buffoon. And they're markedly similar to the comments that you get now. I think the added aspect of it is the fact that the Doctor is a woman, and so you've got a very reactionary audience out there now who are always seeing that as you know, as too preachy or whatever. But I think that I don't think if the BBC sat down and said, okay, you've got to cast a female Doctor now because we need to exploit this virtue signaling that companies are doing these days, I don't necessarily think that didn't happen. However, I don't think that even if that did happen, that makes the performance that Jodie Whittaker gives, or the writing that the different writers have done, less valuable or worthy of saying something. You know, it's not a product in the sense of a lot of other things that are made. And
well,
I think that when to sometimes do a bit of what they call positive discrimination, I don't think personally that is necessarily a bad thing, because to do otherwise is to assume that humans will naturally always treat everything as a level playing field, and history shows that we don't do that, you know. And as writers, you know, I mean, when I've written things before, I thought, you know, I wouldn't automatically write characters who, say, have a disability or have a different ethnicity or something like that. I would naturally default to white, probably male characters. And that isn't because I'm racist or I'm sexist or I'm bigoted against people who have disabilities, but just because I don't have those frames of references. And we need to hear those voices. So to cast and to create a story consciously with those things in, I don't think is a bad thing. I think one of the great achievements I was really proud of, actually, was in a Peter Capaldi story in his last season. There was a story where a subplot of the story was set in a kind of one of these sort of like military research bases where they research deadly diseases and illnesses and things. And it sort of kept cutting to this story where it followed this lady who goes to work and working in this laboratory, and she happened to be a dwarf, but it had no bearing on the plot whatsoever that she had dwarfism. And I thought at the end of it, and no one commented on it, it was not a big deal. It was just they cast an actress who's a dwarf and she did the job. And then, you know, it wasn't a big treatise on dwarfism as such. It was just the fact that there's someone in the show represented. And I think that was a great aspect of Doctor Who, that it is willing to do that, and a benefit of the fact that because it's made by the BBC and they do have this obligation beyond their corporate need to be successful, to not only create programs that educate but also to represent the people who have no choice but to pay a TV license. I mean, if for many, many years, and this is a thing that I think a lot of people in this country and elsewhere don't realise about the BBC, for many, many, we have to pay a licence fee, really, to watch television. And if I was a member of a group other than the one I am, which is a white middle-class man, if I'd been paying for decades a licence fee and never seeing myself represented in any of the dramas, not necessarily stories about what it was like to be black or a dwarf or whatever, or disabled or whatever, but just seeing them represented in a programme. I mean, and in the last few years, as part of BBC initiatives to actually sort out representation a bit more, we've had people who are deaf, we've had transgender people, we've had, as I say, a person with dwarfism, and they've not always been a major aspects of the plot to explore. They're just there, they're in the story, and it just adds a little for want of a better word, it adds a bit more color and a bit more reality to the stories.
Yeah. Well, let me just give two comments, and then we'll do a final segment to sort of wrap things up. The first one comment I want to make is about the female doctors. I've never understood with a fictive character what the attraction is to just having the same thing, especially with a character like the Doctor. As you said, the default being a white male. Well, this is an alien. It's one thing if you wanted to make Napoleon female. That would not work if you're basing it on a historical character. It has to be Napoleon. He has to be a Corsican who takes over France. And then when you talk about the dwarf, it reminded me, I have this long, well, I have a character in my own fiction that dominates several books called the Bit von Rheingold, and he's a Jewish pornographer in the 1960s mainly, who's in bed with the mob. And I decided to make him a real asshole character because when I wanted to originally do a book on a dwarf, and I contacted the Little People of America, and they were so goddamn, they wanted positive stuff. They didn't want a human character. They wanted dwarfs to be this virtue signaling thing. And I said, I'm going to make my dwarf character. He's just a dwarf. He's really an asshole. That's his main character trait. He's a pornographer asshole. But he's a dwarf is just a side thing. So I get what you're saying about that. I think that's one of the things with social justice warriors that's the biggest turnoff is that we want to show everyone in a good light. Well, most people that I've known, racially, by profession, by religion, by disability or not, are just average people. They're not
beings,
yeah. And so this idea that there's a show here in America, I saw one episode of it. It drives me crazy. It's called The Good Doctor, about a guy with autism who plays a doctor, and he's always bathed in light. There's always hope, and it's like, this is the most ridiculous, pathetic character. Just because you have autism doesn't mean that you're an X-Man. And it's like it just really is frustrating.
I think you're right, but I think though that of course, we do have to be careful with representation. That when we do have these characters, we don't fall into tropes of things. Like, for example, for a long time, I think there's a term for it, but this idea of villainous characters having scars or disabilities in some way,
or the Yellow Peril,
all the way back to Richard III, really,
or the Yellow Peril in the 1930s.
Or the Yellow Peril, yeah. And I think that it's important to be aware of how you're representing these things, because after all, although these characters are, they're more compelling because they're more human, they're more real. At the same time, they will act inevitably as representations of cultures and genders and identities. But I think it's being aware of having a counter to that. So if you're going to have a character who's sort of, like you say, there's sort of almost like messianic autistic character, that you'll have another character who's similar but does not have that. So you have a bit more of a range, a broad thing. But what I really like is almost when it's incidental, that other characters are, and I think before, there were rumblings from the more extreme fringes before of virtue signaling and things like that by just having a deaf character in a program, but they have become far more amplified with the debut of Jodie Whittaker's Doctor. But I think that's not just down to Doctor Who. I think that's part of the general discourse that's going on, and also the vitriol of discourse at the moment amongst people. It's not so much a healthy debate as a kind of a spitting competition. And it seems to infect everything at the moment.
When I try to do interviews, I try to get, I hate it when I don't like to do an interview on women's topics where I get women. I'd like to have women talking about film noir or something, but it's very difficult. I did actually get one woman on a film noir show, but it's very difficult because there's this self-segregating that goes on, especially in academia, that drives me crazy. I'm the chair of the left-handed lesbian Eskimo cinema culture, and it's like, well, there were one film ever made about it, and it's like, come on. But so I've talked almost 2 hours with Richard Carrier. For those people who don't know, I will link to his YouTube channel called Clever Dick Films. He's got a series of really outstanding documentaries. I guess at some point maybe you'll weave them into one 10-hour long video. Is that the
I
plan?
don't know. I mean, it's certainly an idea. There's a few errors and mistakes. Just being a kind of a one-man band, inevitably there's errors that creep in, even in my research and things that I'd like to
Yeah.
go back and tweak. So that might
Yeah.
be an idea. And
Yeah.
I've been amazed that actually a few people have said, "Oh, I sat down and watched all your videos back to back," and I thought, you must be really tired of my voice. But certainly there's an audience for it, so maybe I should do a kind of a.
They'd be tired of my
10,
voice. Your voice is a lot smoother. So let me just ask a few sort of grab bag questions that I didn't get a chance to earlier. In the new series, John Hurt plays quote unquote the war doctor. So he's not considered. He's not like Doctor 8.5 or something.
It's very controversial. You've stepped into the answers. Basically, the reason for that, the real world reason for that, was because when they did the 50th anniversary special story, they wanted to get Christopher Eccleston, who played the Ninth Doctor, to come back. Because that story revolves around events that had happened just prior to when the series returned in the storyline.
Okay.
But Christopher Eccleston, for reasons that I will go into more in my next video because they're quite convoluted, didn't really want to return to the show. So that left the writer Stephen Moffat with a problem to solve, because he wanted to tell this story about the Time War and how it had come about. But he also wanted it to be a big event. And so that led to the creation of a secret incarnation of the Doctor that we'd never known about. Up until that point, we'd assumed that Paul McGann's Doctor had regenerated into Christopher Eccleston, and there'd been time with his Doctor and an off-screen story of how that had happened. But there was this little twist leading into the 50th anniversary special that, in fact, the Doctor had this extra incarnation for several hundred years. But part of the story of that was that when he regenerated into him is when he decides. Up until that point, he had been very much on the outskirts of a big war that was happening between his people and the Daleks, and didn't take an active role because the Doctor, although this is debatable, is not really. He's more of a, not a pacifist so much, but he doesn't like guns and eschews violence, and really is there to help and to heal. Hence why he's called the Doctor. But at that point, through different trauma, he decided to be a warrior. And so he the interesting thing about the Doctor, and they've really developed this in the modern series, is this concept of the fact that the Doctor, of course, is not his name. That's why the show is Doctor Who. It should really have a question mark after it. And the Doctor is kind of a persona, not really a persona that he adopts, because it's him, but it's an ideal that he tries to live up to, the Doctor. And so when he regenerates and decides to be a warrior, he says, right, I cannot be the Doctor anymore. And so the idea is, for that incarnation, he did not call himself the Doctor. And the war ended. He ended the war, or so he believes, by essentially killing both opponents, by wiping out both his own people and the Daleks, or so he thinks. And that act is what traumatizes him and leads to several story arcs within the new series. And so for that incarnation, he's called the War Doctor, but only outside of the fandom. In the show, in the audios and books, he just refuses to be known as the Doctor and doesn't like people calling it that to him.
Was that whole trope taken from, because there's a comic book character here in the U.S., a superhero called Green Lantern, who killed off the Green Lantern Corps. Was that, do you know if that was...
It might well have been. I've not heard it, and I'm yet to do sort of really...
Because after they killed off Superman, in the early 90s, when they had the Superman Dies story with... I'm not a big comic book fan, but I was working at a publisher in the warehouse, and I read these comic books on my break. And so they killed off Superman, and then the alien... a guy, I forget, who's got a rock-type face, I forget the name of the character, ends up killing the coast city of Green Lantern. Green Lantern ends up going insane. He kills off all of the Green Lanterns in the galaxy and whatnot. And so I just wondered if
that might have been. I think it was partly a desire to kind of get rid of the Time Lords and of Gallifrey, to make them again this kind of mysterious thing that they had been originally, because they'd kind of become a bit pedestrian.
Yeah.
And in the original premise of Doctor Who, that's never mentioned in the actual program, but the idea was that he was fleeing from a big war between his people and an unknown enemy. So I think it was partly inspired by those things.
Okay.
But I think the colouring of that element probably came into it as well.
You mentioned Douglas Adams had contributed to the show. I've seen online some people say that the Galaxy universe and the Gallifreyan universe are related. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
It might well be. I mean, the thing was, he when he was the script editor of Doctor Who, it was on that sort of cusp, really, of him really breaking out, becoming massive at that time, because he had written Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for the radio, because that, I believe, is how it started. And that was sort of going out as he got the job. He'd written a Doctor Who story at the same time, and on the strength of that, he was given the role of script editor. So it sort of all came about at the same time. And I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, he recycled some of his ideas from different things. I mean, I did read an article recently in Doctor Who magazine where they were looking through his old notebooks, which are kept in his old university library, I believe. I've got it, I think, at Cambridge. And they were looking through those, and you could see how he was sort of coming up with ideas for Hitchhikers at the same time he was coming up for ideas for Doctor Who, and sometimes he borrows one from the other.
Yeah.
So I think that well could defeat it. And obviously he brought a lot of comedy elements to the show as well. So his era is I mean, I think that really pleased Tom Baker, because he's quite an irreverent character anyway.
Yeah.
And so you get a more of a Hitchhiker's feel to some of the character dynamics.
Over the decades, the show has sort of veered back and forth between sort of what people would call, I guess, hard sci-fi, and I wouldn't say soft sci-fi, but I'd call it almost dream logic, oniric logic. There are some of those shows, I mentioned a couple of them, the Satan one comes to mind within the Tom Baker era, and a few others where it almost seems dreamlike, like the Doctor is dreaming. I mean, he might not literally be dreaming, but almost that the Doctor is creating problems for himself, in a sense. Has there ever been anyone who thought that maybe, you know, there's in America here, there's a thought that most of American television is the universe of a character on a show called Saint Elsewhere, a little boy who's dreaming, because actors have played the same characters across different series. So if you appeared in this one and you appear in this one, then that makes that whole, and there's this whole blooming tree. So is there, I don't know, is there any thought to that maybe that the Doctor is just a character in someone else's world or something?
Well, it's funny you say that, actually. I mean, there is a kind of a meta story where there's sort of three types of Doctor Who story. There's sort of like the science fiction story, outer space monsters, more like Star Trek or Star Wars. Then you've got the kind of more historical character drama based one, and then you've got the more fairy tale element. And sometimes those three can overlap, and that's down to the sensibilities of the production team that worked on it. But one of the most literally fairy tale stories is a Patrick Troughton story called The Mind Robber. And in that, the TARDIS lands in a kind of strange universe, and it turns out that they're actually in the land of fiction, which is a universe brought into creation by a writer. He's supposed to be he was sort of like a hack pulp writer from the 20s or 30s, and he's ended up in this thing where he's created this reality, and the Doctor and others have to encounter random characters who can only speak with the dialogue that they had in their books. And it's a very, very clever story. But there is a theory.
Doc Savage.
Yeah, but there is a theory that the Doctor never actually escaped from the universe, and that all the stuff that's happened since is all in he became the new master of the land of fiction. And that world and the universe that's happened since has all been in his imagination. So there is that idea, I suppose. And then there's been a few meta references, but they're more like little Easter egg things where, for example, in a David Tennant story, the Doctor has to make himself human and give himself a whole, almost like going to the witness protection program, but he doesn't even know it. He convinces himself that he's a human, and there's a point where he's talking to this lady, and she's asking him about his past, and his whole part, he says, my mother was called Verity and my father was called Sidney, and in reality Verity Newman was the first producer of Doctor Who, and Sidney Newman is obviously the first showrunner. So there's little meta references like that from time to time, I think.
Let me just talk about the Daleks, since they're generally considered the greatest foes. They're sort of what the Klingons are to the Star Trek universe, in a sense. The Klingons have that language, their own language, which is the largest fake language, and the Daleks. The thing that the Daleks, obviously, the look influenced R2-D2 in Star Wars. I mean, I think quite obviously. But the thing with the Daleks, even in one of your videos, you talk about how they became sort of a running gag in, I guess, the late 70s, because you could just knock them over. They're like garbage cans, and yet they're not sleek and is there any internal logic in the series as to how these sort of walking garbage cans powered by bugs are such a menace? Because if you look at, I mean, not that I like Star Trek, but I'm not a fan of a lot of the stuff, but like the Borg characters, at least they're scary looking, and occasionally, if you look at the Alien from the Alien series before that went in the crapper, you could understand the fear. But if the Daleks came down, it'd be like, I'd look for a button to toss my garbage in them,
Well, I think that's partly due to the fact that, of course, when Doctor Who was originally created, it was created to have essentially 13, 14 episodes, and then at sea. So, it wasn't conceived from the beginning to be this, ongoing thing. And Terry Nation, the writer of the first Dalek, the creator of the Daleks, I think he'd gone to see a ballet, and I think he had seen like the whirling dervishes, where they spin and their skirts sort of spin out. And the guy he was with, who was a famous comedian who had written before called Tony Hancock, I think turned around and said, that'd be a really good idea for an alien. So when Terry Nation came to write the Dalek story, he thought, I don't want it to be something that's recognizable as a kind of a human in a costume, because he knew it was going to be a costume of some description, but he didn't want, the creature from the Black Lagoon type monster. And so that was sort of the philosophy behind it. And he came up with this idea of a moving pepper pot, essentially, with a gun and an arm. And then the set design, funnily enough, was almost Ridley Scott, who of course went on to be make Alien. He worked at the BBC at the time as a production designer, but he didn't get the job on the Daleks, and a guy called Raymond Cusick did. And so he designed the look. And obviously, you got to bear in mind the practicality of the time of what was affordable and things like that. He designed the whole Dalek look and how it would move around. And I think it was that combination, the look of it, which was very striking in the show, at least. I think if you just saw one on the street, it probably wouldn't be that intimidating. But in the way it was revealed in the show and how aggressive they were, especially in that first story, a lot of the sort of almost cliches of the Daleks weren't quite present because they hadn't grown up. The voices are grating and electronic, but they're not quite the same as they became later on. They're not always saying exterminate, but they're very aggressive. They're kind of scary in that first story, and it really captured the imagination. So they said, well, we've got to bring them back, and so they kept coming back. So the idea of them originally was they would design someone like that because they were contained in their city. They couldn't go beyond their city, and they kind of ignored this in subsequent stories.
Well, they suffer from what's called villain decay. Villain decay is a term that's used online to describe villains that are used too much, If you can defeat a villain like the Borg in Star Trek, are not the omnipotent, baddies they originally were thought to be.
They always lose.
But the thing that I was talking about, the dream logic. I don't know if you've ever seen. There's a film from Laurel and Hardy called Babes in Toyland, or the March of the Wooden Soldiers. It's a Christmas film here in the U.S. And in it was made in 1931 or 32. There's a Scrooge-like character that has these animalistic kind of characters, but you can see on their asses they're sort of flaps. You know how night shirts used to have flaps to go to the bathroom. And you could see that on these characters. And yet, for a child, that's more scary because horror, and I did a show on horror, 2 shows actually on horror films and whatnot. Horror is reality being just a little bit off. It's
Yeah,
not
and I think
necessarily.
that's why for some
Yeah,
people
it's not
the
necessarily
silence.
CG stuff, but
Yeah,
it's if you and I are talking, and then all of a sudden on the wall behind us we saw some spider that was a yard across. It would be something a little bit off. So in that way, I can understand the Daleks being scary.
and I think I remember when I was younger, my cousin once saying to me that he found the Cybermen more scary than the Daleks because he could see them as people.
Yeah,
And I can get that. I prefer the Daleks over the Cybermen, but they're very different. They kind of became the same kind of thing later on.
yeah,
But I think what the Daleks represent in a way is what's frightening about them, in that they are this distillation of intolerance and
yeah,
hatred and twisted, logic, and they're almost like, as I said in the video, sort of reductio ad absurdum argument for nationalism in a way, and so. They're quite compelling. That I think that the design of them originally, the original story was this idea that it was kind of this morality play about intolerance and acceptance and things, and so they're contained in their city, and they're quite pathetic in a way. And I think there's an interesting line in a David Tennant story where he confronts the Daleks and he says, you're trapped in there all day, all night. You never, see the sky or anything like that. No wonder you scream all the time. And it's that thing. And also in the early stories, you got that consciously or otherwise. I don't know if they planned to do it because the operators of the Daleks always were moving them all the time. So it's like they're always shaking. Yeah. They're always ready to attack. There's no rest. I think they became quite silly later on because they were so popular and everywhere, they became the show then when they used them kind of referenced that silliness in a way, but also because once they introduced the character of their creator in the 70s, Davros, he likewise became such a popular character that they kept bringing him back. So the Daleks very much became like second fiddle. They were like the drones. But in the new series, there's very clever, if you do get the chance to watch a story called Dalek with Christopher Eccleston, and that was their reintroduction, really. It's a good example of dismantling all the jokes over the years of just run upstairs, they can't follow you upstairs, and you see a Dalek, there's a bit where they're running away from the Dalek upstairs, and one of them turns to the Dalek and says, well, you're so fearsome, why don't you follow us? And then the Dalek goes, elevate, and like lifts up and starts following upstairs. And then there's a bit where obviously he's got the plunger on the arm, and this guy says, what are you going to do, sucker me to death? And then the plunger like crushes his face. So they kind of very easy, and also like you can't touch it, because if you touch it you'll like burst into flames and things. And so they kind of took all those jokes that have been built up over the years as a figure of fun and dismantled them in the course of 45 minutes. So now I think they're back, or at least for a while they were back to what they had been originally.
Well, we talked about your future in the beginning of the show, what you plan to do. Let me just talk, if you peer out Doctor Who's future. I mean, we're here now almost on the cusp of 2020. Do you think that it's something that in 50 years is still going to be going, or is there some virtue to actually having something to its time? I mean, for example, I mentioned Doc Savage. He was big in the middle 20th century. I saw that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson might play Doc Savage, in a film. But in a sense, his time has passed. He's a cultural artifact, and the influence that he may have had on a Doctor Who or Superman is interesting. Do you think in 2070, say 50 years, that there should be another kind of character that fills that niche that Doctor Who does, and that Doctor Who should be a late 20th, early 21st century character? Or do you think, why not go on? Because Sherlock Holmes, let's face it, I know they redid or rebooted Sherlock Holmes and it got good reviews or whatnot, but I don't know, come up with something new. Stop just repeating yourself,
Yeah, I mean, there is a big element of that. I mean, everything appears to be remakes or reimagined. A lot of them rely on that nostalgic
goddamn
feeling.
Disney does it. They won't let Mickey Mouse fall into copyright.
Watch this film again.
Yeah.
And give us $2 billion. I think there's a big argument there, definitely. But I think if Doctor Who's done well, the benefit of Doctor Who, and also perhaps its downfall,
Yeah.
to some respect, is that it can reinvent itself by the virtue of the nature of what it is and the look of it and the casting of it, and continue on while still keeping true to the fundamental elements. So rather than the Doctor Who stories now are different to how they were in the 60s by virtue of not just in the look and the design and the pacing of them, but also in the nature of the kinds of things they explore. They can be topical and explore different issues that are relevant to us now that weren't even thought of in the 60s. And so I think that's something that is very strong for its longevity. It's not just a question of bringing it back and redoing it and making it a little bit shinier. There's more to it than that. And so obviously I'm biased, but I think that Doctor Who is in a way different from, say, Star Wars. I mean, I enjoy Star Wars, but very much the modern Star Wars films are remakes of the earlier ones, and they're an effort to recapture that, so people can say, oh, I know what an X-Wing looks like, I grew up with that, and it's got an X-Wing in it now. And what I find is quite telling is when they try and divert from the kind of soft reboot format, it doesn't go down very well. So like The Last Jedi, I mean, there are a lot of very valid points about why it isn't a particularly good film, and there are a lot of very bigoted reasons why people don't like it, and it goes back to that whole cultural war that's going on. But at the same time, I kind of respect it for actually having the balls to say, no, it's not going to happen the way you want to do it. There's not going to be a massive lightsaber fight at the end. It's all illusion, and Luke is not a hero. He's turned into a bit of an asshole. And so I kind of respect them, but it doesn't go down very well because people want what they like, and they like what they know. They don't want something different. And I think that Doctor Who, whilst keeping the fundamentals, has never been afraid to change things up a little bit from time to time. And whenever it gets stuck in a particular style, that's when it starts to lose its viewers. And I think with Peter Capaldi's era was the end of a very long run of one person being in control of it. And now a new person's in control of it, and things have changed. But that's why I'm quite optimistic about it, because I think people will get used to it and accept it. I think the bigots will never accept it because that's the way they are, but I don't really want them if they're going to be bigoted. I think that the nature of television and programming means that it will probably end up being cancelled at some point, because everything does. I mean, when it comes back next year, it'll be its 12th series of the new series, but it's actually been on British television now since 2005. So it will be its 15th year since it came back with Christopher Eccleston. That's a long time for a television program to live. But it might sound a little bit over the top, but I do feel that Doctor Who has become a part of our cultural heritage in a way. He's a character a bit like Robin Hood or Sherlock Holmes, like you mentioned, and I think that he will, and or she will, come back in some form and continue on. And I think the 90s period, the wilderness years, as you mentioned earlier, shows us that as long as people are interested in his stories and want to discover those stories, they will live on in some form or another, and people will be compelled to be creative by it. Because all the thing that I didn't mention earlier when you asked me about, how did I come to make the films and stuff, is that my interest in filmmaking started with Doctor Who, because I watched it all the time, and I thought, ironically, the homegrown nature of it, the rustic nature of it, sometimes the unshowiness of it, inspired me. Said, well, I can see that this is a program that's been made by a group of people. It's not all a CGI light show where I don't know how it's done kind of thing. It's just a magic thing in front of me. And so I thought, someone made these costumes, someone made that set, someone made that monster, and it inspired me, and it inspired my best friend, who has since gone on, and actually I'm very jealous, he actually got to work on Doctor Who and help make some of the new Cyberman costumes and things. So and so many people who work in the industry now, not just on Doctor Who, but on other things, cite Doctor Who as a real formative inspiration, and then going on and making programming and writing and things like that. So, yeah, I think it's more than just a television show in that sense.
Well, Clever Dick Films is the YouTube channel of Richard D. Carrier. I would urge people, not only Doctor Who fans, but if you want to know how to make and craft a good 45 or an hour long documentary, watch it because I could do another hour just talking about the crafting. It's an excellent piece of documentary. You should be very proud of it. And I would say though, research Charters and Caldecott, those films, I think they had an influence. Also, Doc Savage, you may be able to work them into a
Uh-huh.
later thing. And I would love to, as a fan of Patrick McGoohan, see a documentary you did of Patrick McGoohan, his Danger Man and Prisoner show. Because if you ever get around to watching Danger Man, especially, it's, I think, by far the best spy series of the late 50s, early 60s. But anyway, thank you for spending 2+ hours speaking with me. It was really great show.
Thank you.